Let us pick up our books and our pens. They are our most powerful weapons. One child, one teacher, one book, and one pen can change the world.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of Access Point brought to you live from New York. I'm Aisha Tanseem. Why are we in New York? We're in New York because Malala Yousafzai is in New York. We all know Malala as the brave teenage girl from Swat who was shot by Taliban for a simple dream. She wanted to go to school. It was very clear today how badly the Taliban failed. Not only is Malala going to school now, but today, on her 16th birthday, declared Malala Day by the UN, the whole world is standing with her to demand that all Malalas of the world are given the right to go to school. Let's listen to what Malala Yousafzai had to say about why the Taliban tried to stop her.
The power of education frightens them. They are afraid of women. The power of the voice of women frightens them. And that is why they killed 14 innocent students in the recent attack in Quetta. And that is why they killed female teachers and polio workers in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. That is why they're blasting schools every day, because they were and they are afraid of change, afraid of equality that we will bring into our society.
To talk about the change that Malala's dream can bring, we have in our New York studio Sadaf Zulfikar, the education specialist for UNICEF Pakistan. She is in New York especially to attend the Malala Day event at the UN headquarters. Our second guest is Alice Albright, the CEO of Global Partnership for Education. This is an umbrella of 60 developing country governments and NGOs for education. And joining us via Skype from London is Anjana Raza, who will join us in a little bit, the CEO of Development and Literacy. Development and Literacy builds schools in underprivileged areas in Pakistan. And our resident social media guru, Sara Zaman, is waiting for us in our DC studios to bring us all the feedback from you, the viewers. So I'll start with you, Ms. Zulfikar. Tell me, we're here in New York talking about the Millennium Development Goals and Malala. How far is Pakistan from its Millennium Development Goal of universal education for all children of Pakistan?
Thank you very much, Ms. Aisha. It's a pleasure to be here and to be attending the Malala Day event among Malala Yousafzai and all the global youth participants. In terms of education in Pakistan, of course, the situation is not very encouraging. If you look at the issues, they would range from missing facilities, very basic facilities of a washroom, clean drinking water, boundary wall, to shortage of female teachers or availability of the female teacher during the day of school, schools which are constructed quite far from the communities, from gender disparities that exist between the rural and urban divide, and they deepen as we go further to the FATA and KP and Balochistan. This situation certainly adds up to the 3.4 million girls, roughly, who are out of school, among the 5.4 million children in Pakistan who do not attend school at their primary age.
So out of the 57 million children that are out of school now,
5.4 million.
5.4 million are in Pakistan.
Yeah.
So I'm saying out of the 57 million children in Pakistan, almost 5 million, more than 5 million are in Pakistan. Now, I want to talk in detail with both of you about why this is happening. But before we do that, let's go quickly to DC, where Sara Zaman is waiting, because you also have given us feedback on why this is happening. So Sara, take it away.
All right, Aisha, when we asked our commenters what they think are some of the biggest hurdles in giving every child access to basic education in Pakistan, they pointed out two sets of problems. One is a set of social problems and the other is institutional. In terms of social problems, Bakir Ali on Facebook says, poverty, extremism and ignorance are some of the biggest hurdles. People are worried about livelihood, so they either put their children to work or marry them off at a young age instead of understanding the value of education. and pointing out institutional hurdles. Azad Baloch says misuse of funds by politicians is a big problem. In addition to that, the curriculum is outdated and ghost schools and ghost teachers are making matters worse. And Innocent Pari says there is a lack of planning and strategizing. Attention is not paid to how a school is performing and what kind of education is being provided there. Teachers are not held accountable for their performance either. Now, let's also take a quick look at what some of the folks that we talked to on the streets of Pakistan are saying about this issue.
पाकिस्तान में बहुत ज़्यादा तालीम महंगी है, इस वजह से आम जो गरीब लोग हैं वो तालीम हासिल नहीं कर सकते। बच्चों को काम पे लगा देते हैं बहुत कम उम्र में।
एजुकेशन के लिए जब तक कैपिटल ज़्यादा नहीं रखेंगे, अपने बजट का हिस्सा ज़्यादा नहीं रखेंगे, वी डू नॉट थिंक ऑफ इट एज एन इन्वेस्टमेंट। हमारे यहाँ ये भी एक एक्सपेंडिचर है, इन्वेस्टमेंट नहीं समझते हम इसको।
So a young student was saying that since education is very expensive, many parents prefer to send their kids to work rather than to school. And our second commenter said that we don't allocate enough funds to this sector because education is seen as an expenditure and not as an investment. Now, to share your thoughts with us, log on to facebook.com/accesspointwithat or join the conversation at VOA Urdu's Facebook page. For now, let's go back to Aisha in our New York studio.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So a whole list of problems. Obviously, people are aware of what's wrong. They mentioned poverty, ignorance, misuse of funds, ghost schools, lack of planning, education, expensive education. I want to talk to you, Ms. Albright, about how Pakistan stands in the region, the surrounding countries, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, India, Afghanistan. How does Pakistan rate?
Well, let me also thank you for including me. It's a terrific day to be in New York and celebrate the heroism and the bravery of Malala. So thanks for including me, and it's great to be with our friends from UNICEF. You know, it would take a while to go through sort of at a detailed level the problems that all of those countries that you've just mentioned have individually, but one can make some, I think, some important generalizations. Many of those countries suffer from being fragile states or conflict-afflicted states, and that causes, you know, particular issues in terms of delivery of quality education. They all certainly lack sufficient resources. They all are working on improving the management of the school systems, which touches many, many different issues, from teacher training, from adequate materials, from a way of thinking about how to focus on quality learning outcomes. So many of them share, you know, some of the same characteristics. Now, of course, if you were to study the countries individually, they all have slightly different characteristics to them.
So is Pakistan kind of in the middle, more towards the bottom, more towards the top in the region?
It has some serious challenges compared to others in the region, but we don't, in the work that we do, and we work in 58 countries, we don't, frankly, spend a lot of time comparing them. What we try to do, although we're a very small organization, we are much bigger as a partnership. What we do is focus on the particular challenges that each country happens to be having, and we work very closely with the governments in all of those countries.
So let's talk about the challenge, starting with you, Ms. Zulfikar. Of all the challenges that people mentioned, that you mentioned before, which one would you tackle first as somebody who deals with this issue day to day?
I think there are two ways of looking at it. As the colleague from Washington mentioned, that there is a set of social problems and institutional problems. And if you really need to prioritize, you have to prioritize among the social problems that hinder girl education. People traditionally are in a culture of marrying girls off at a very young age, at the age of 14, 15, or perhaps 16. So how do we work towards addressing, you know, this
the girl problem? Although I'll say something. I know that you have more knowledge about this issue. I've done a little bit of work on female education, not much, but traveled through. And I was amazed at how many people wanted to send their girls to school, at least the primary school, even in our conservative areas. And the other thing that amazed me was how many schools were either ghost schools or they had a building, no teachers. I found animals in those buildings. I found storage space in those buildings. I found everything but teachers and students. So how big of a problem is just corruption?
You're absolutely correct. In terms of missing facilities within schools, ghost schools, this is very correct. And this pins down to the fact that what sort of capacity the government education departments have to monitor, to plan, and to actually reach out to these communities in terms of having infrastructure, appointing teachers, putting in classroom furniture, learning materials, providing bathroom facilities. That is very correct. In terms of demand for education, yes, it is certainly there. The problem comes in where parents do not find the value of education. A parent would not like to send his child, girl or boy to school if they do not see him or her coming back by learning something. Children sit through the school for the full day and they come back with no learning, with no clarity, with no sort of advancement in their conceptual and analytical thinking. So parents find it easier or better off to make them sit at home, to work somewhere, and not to send them to school. The only reason being that the quality of education is so poor. The teaching methodologies are so conventional.
Well, unfortunately, the teachers themselves have gone through the same school system. So we can't blame them. But Ms. Albright, your organization deals with training teachers and helping them. How do you go into a society where teachers themselves have gone through really bad education and they've graduated, because everybody in the end graduates in Pakistan? How do you train those teachers?
Well, you need to go at it sort of inch by inch, first of all. But just to your point about quality, one thing that's happening in the international community that's very exciting is that people are beginning to, at the policy level, shift from looking at education through a lens of inputs, how many schools are being built, how many textbooks are being built, to looking at learning quality and quality outcomes. And that sounds subtle, but it's actually essential, because it's actually the quality outcomes that are going to drive better development, better health outcomes, and all the other range of areas that are touched on so much by education. But we need, to answer your question about teachers, we need to begin to change the way that we train teachers, and that is very much a district by district process, and that too has to focus on learning outcomes.
So I will come to you for more specific Pakistan-related questions, what you're doing there. But what I want to ask you, Ms. Zulfikar, and this is totally, I will not name any names because I don't have the paperwork to prove it, but as a journalist, I've heard that in Pakistan, especially now that it's a provincial subject, in some provinces, education ministry is, as they say, very popular, because some people, no names, can make a lot of money off of it. You have lots of ghost schools, you build a school on paper, you get a budget for it, you get a budget for books, you get a budget for building, no school. How common is this problem in Pakistan?
Well, yes, this is a problem. There is budget available. In the papers, you would find that X number of books have been provided to X school. But once you go out to monitor, actually, maybe the situation would be entirely different. But with the recent legislation on education, which is Article 25A, and which makes the state eligible to have children enrolled between the ages of 5 to 16 and provide them with free and compulsory education. Now, the governments and the provincial governments are kind of putting together plans how to reach out to children within their provincial districts and their provincial communities. So
just interrupting very quickly, people say that it's a good thing that education is now a provincial subject. How do you feel as an somebody who works in the field?
Certainly, yes, this is a very good advancement in the field of education, because in Pakistan, each of the one province is entirely a different life in its own. Balochistan is different from Sindh, Punjab is different from KPK. So this is an opportunity for the people to have more realistic, more contextual and more language-based education. Now the provincial governments have this authority to plan curriculum that they want to impart to their students in certain community or in a certain district. So I look at this as a very positive sign.
How important is it, Ms. Albright, that Malala was here today? Female education, explain to my viewers, apart from a girl getting educated, apart from the normal benefits of learning to read and write and getting a job, what kind of changes does it bring in society?
Well, in addition to what you've mentioned, there are a number of critical knock-on effects from educating girls. Very clear benefits in health. They're able to take care of themselves and their families. Very clear benefits in neonatal health, for example. I used to work in the global health field, and we can see that educated mothers who understand themselves how to take care of their children and themselves the benefit of education has a substantial impact on a family's well-being. There also are substantial economic benefits. A girl's income increases, or potential for income over the life of her own working life. And we also see, and there's been some studies on this, that the overall potential for GDP growth in some of these countries will be higher if you educate girls. So there's a number of effects both at a micro level as well as at a macro level.
Now, in case of Malala, security was a big issue. We want to talk about security challenges, and I'll come to both of you for security challenges, but let's take another quick detour to DC, to Sara Zaman, to find out what our viewers have to say about it. Sara?
All right, for most of our commenters on social media platforms, security of schools and of students is definitely a concern. Shahvar Ali says that it's hard to have security gates or checkpoints on main roads where many schools are located, and transportation carrying students is also often targeted. She says parents, schools, local government, law enforcement authorities, and transporters should all work together at every level to improve coordination and information sharing. And Zephania Free Education, she says, we need to produce citizens who respect schools and appreciate those who are doing something to promote education. This is the only way to protect our future. And I want to mention here that Zephania Free Education is a free homeschool run by a volunteer in Gujranwala. Kudos to you for your efforts. And lastly, Irfan Aryan says that police officials of the area where a school is located should be held accountable for its security, and nearby mosques should also be closely monitored for suspicious people and activities. Our video commenters also gave us some ideas about improving security for students. Let's take a quick look.
You know, this is something I think which is to do with the school itself or the college itself. Like we have proper guards and chowkidars and maids who see to who's coming and who's not coming. So this is something that access has to be limited.
मेरे ख्याल से तो एक पूरा सेशंस होने चाहिए वीक्स के या वैसे जिनको एजुकेट किया जाए कि अगर आप किस तरह की चीज़ देखें तो आपको किस तरह रिस्पॉन्ड करना है.
So along with monitoring traffic into schools, as one of the suggestions is to conduct civil defense classes to teach students how to respond to a security threat or an attack. To continue this discussion, let's go back to our New York studio.
Thank you very much, Sara. So we heard a couple of interesting things involving the local mosques, local police, of course, a no-brainer, but also training students, which has started happening in some of the schools here after the recent attacks on children. Ms. Zulfikar, how many of these are being used in Pakistan, and what are some of the other things that might be used to improve security?
I think one of the things that we are, through UNICEF programming, that we are practicing in communities in far-flung areas of Pakistan is to engage very actively with local communities, with local religious leaders, with mother support groups, with fathers, with school management committees to encourage students coming to school in terms of counseling them, mentoring them, you know, providing them with basic socio-psychological support to, you know, be comfortable, to be looking forward to coming to school and staying there, because this is Pakistan is operating in a very complex, challenging security situation, and of course the world cannot stop, the work cannot stop, we cannot sit back home and, you know, do nothing. So that is how we are kind of engaging with these a lot of different stakeholders at grassroots level to encourage them to continue their work.
Now, one thing that was mentioned here, and I think a lot of people in the West may not understand this, but transportation is a huge problem, particularly when it comes to girls. So are there any specific steps, Ms. Albright, that maybe your organization is doing with people on the ground to improve transportation for students?
Well, you're right to point out that security issues absolutely confront girls, because when families see that their girls are going to be at risk for having to walk long distances to school, the immediate decision that they'll make is to not send them. So it's an absolute issue. The other issue that we come across that is girls related in particular is having, you know, sufficient latrine facilities, because that will also be a real issue for girls going to school. So you're very right to point out. We work across a range with governments across a range of different areas within education that may very well in some cases include education. We're at the early stages of our work in Pakistan, and we will see how that issue comes up. But it does get to the number of schools, although, you know, we really have to balance our focus between that and the quality. But if we are able to locate more schools closer to families and then work closely with the communities, and I know that UNICEF does that very well, to encourage the families to send the girls to school, you begin to get at the problem.
Are you working with like a particular NGO or a particular group in Pakistan?
The way that we work is we are a very small organization per se. We're only a little more than 60 people. But what we do is we work with implementing organizations throughout all of these countries. And there's now a group of them, which we're very proud to say we've got a very happy relationship with UNICEF. And so we will work with UNICEF to design what the program is in a particular country. In this case, we're working with them in 2 of the provinces in Pakistan. And we will work with them to identify what the specific requirements are in those provinces, which may very well include more schools, more teachers, may include more transportation, may include community outreach. It really depends on what the particular issues are. But our partners are UNICEF, or the World Bank. We work with a number of the bilateral agencies. We are going to begin to work with civil society. And the point there is to figure out, first of all, make sure that we've got a broad range of partners, but also figure out who is best placed in each particular country to help us.
Ms. Zulfikar, do you see a difference between rural areas and urban areas? I mean, some of these issues that I mentioned, that she just mentioned, having toilet facilities, having clean water to drink, these are some of the issues that a lot of people don't even think about when they think about schools. So do you think there are more facilities in urban areas, or do you think that underprivileged areas are the same across the country?
I won't rank them both on equal basis. Of course, there is a slight difference in terms of public sector urban schools have facilities in terms of bathroom or boundary wall, but how well equipped is that is an issue. I mean, a lot of times in urban slums, or the schools which are based in urban slums, either they are private schools or public schools, lack these facilities. Or even if they are there, they are not up to the mark, they are not in a functioning position.
So talking about lacking facilities, we've already mentioned that the government doesn't have enough machinery to monitor what's happening in public schools. But are there any laws about what a school should look like? What facilities should it offer its students? What kind of, not just curriculum, but environment should it offer?
Yeah, certainly. UNICEF has a child-friendly school model which clearly lays out how a school should look like, what a classroom should look like, what kind of learning methodology should be adopted, what kind of...
Does Pakistan have any
Yes,
laws?
Pakistan has a huge number of UNICEF-supported child-friendly schools which are in very remote and hard-to-reach communities. We are trying to...
But what I'm trying to ask is, does Pakistan have any laws that this is what schools should look like? Would it be illegal, for example, to not provide these facilities?
Constitutionally, no. But there is a framework of for example, how a school should, what a school should contain.
So that's basically...
At the time of construction, it is built in that way. A bathroom would be built, a playground would be built, a roof with 2 fans would be built.
But a lot of...
How it is maintained, how it is...
a lot of schools, although are not built as schools, they're just houses that people rent to then change into schools. Now, we've talked about a lot of problems, and you've mentioned some of the solutions. Let's go and find out what our viewers think are solutions to these problems. And for that, we go once again to you, Sara Zaman.
So commenters on our social media platforms have given us a lot of different ideas about what should be done to improve access to basic education in Pakistan. But before I share those with you, let's start with a student from Islamabad and see what he suggested on camera.
ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा स्कूल्स कायम करने चाहिए, स्कूल रेट्स जो फीस होती हैं वो कम करनी चाहिए और टीचर्स को अच्छे उनकी ट्रेनिंग के साथ भेजना चाहिए ताकि वो बच्चों को...
So what our young student wants are more schools, well-trained teachers and low school fees. Now let's take a look at our social media. On Facebook, Salim Altaf suggests using one education system across the country. He says providing education should be the responsibility of the state alone. And rehabilitation process for those parents should be started who have no source of income except their children. Shahid Kamran says there should be a massive media campaign to create awareness about the importance of education. Disparity between public and private schools should be eliminated, and government should give subsidy to underprivileged students who want to go to private schools and don't want to attend government schools. And Sajid Mir says that staff promotions should be performance-based and private schools should be brought under government control. A lot of people have, in fact, made this suggestion on our Facebook and on our other social media platforms, and they also want to see the same curriculum across the country so people from different economic backgrounds get the same kind of education. Now, to read more comments or share your thoughts, join the community at facebook.com/accesspointwithat or VOA Urdu's Facebook page. That's all from the DC studio. Let's go back to Aisha in New York.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Now, once again, our viewers have given really interesting suggestions. I want to take one of them and put it to both of you, starting with you, Ms. Zulfikar. This idea of having one education system, Pakistan, some people call it almost a class-based system. Some people go to English medium schools. Those are slightly more expensive. Some are radically more expensive. And other people go to government schools, most of which are Urdu medium. Yes, you get an education, but it's substandard. You want to give any important examination that ends up being in English, you feel like you're at a loss. How big of a problem is it in a country like Pakistan?
Surely it's a huge problem. Pakistan has a huge class divide. Huge class divide. And of course, as you have very rightly pointed out, that some schools are expensive, some are radically expensive, which can only be afforded by a certain group of elite, and the poor, either they would, or the middle income people, either would send their children to private schools or would end up sending their children to public schools. In terms of having one system for education, in principle, yes, it's a great idea, it should be done, but how realistic is that in terms of the huge class difference, in terms of the huge key players who run these private schooling education in Pakistan? How politically it's feasible is a question.
All the politicians send their kids to these private schools. Yeah. Now, we have one of the analysts in Pakistan, Dr. Mehdi Hassan. Every time I talk to him, he gives one very interesting suggestion, which is like, you make it mandatory for all elected members to send their kids to public schools, and they'll all change within months. And I think he's kind of right. I think if you're running for parliament, you should send your kids to public schools. This idea in a country like Pakistan, where a lot of people do eventually go abroad for job opportunities, to have the whole system under one language, be it Urdu or the local language, how feasible is that?
Well, one can certainly understand where that idea is coming from, given how many of these countries are trying to improve their competitiveness on a global market scale, for example. But if you talk to educational experts about pedagogy and some of the challenges, many of them will tell you that it is very difficult to teach young kids to learn how to read in a language that is completely unknown to them. And so what they suggest is that you start learning to read in your mother tongue and then you switch over to something else perhaps a bit later. So I think that
is there research that proves whether it inhibits your learning over a long term?
Yes, there's a lot of it. And what people are beginning to say now is that in order to really have kids learn how to read effectively, they have to learn in a language that they hear, because learning how to read, as we all know from the children around us, is very connected to hearing the language. So that right there presents, a whole different array of challenges, because in many of the countries that we work in, there are hundreds of languages. So it introduces a whole new challenge in terms of how do you introduce teaching materials and books and things like that. But on your question of government schools versus private schools, we very much believe that the government has a huge role to play and a responsibility for delivering quality education. Now, in many countries, some of the governments choose to work with other providers, whether they're the faith-based community or NGOs.
So basically just give subsidies to kids.
Form relationships with them in whatever way, and it takes different forms. And, a lot of people...
So, and very quickly, because we were talking about that, Ms. Zulfikar, in Pakistan, maybe it's politically very different to tell people not to have their kids in English medium. What do you think about that?
Of course, yes. I mean, again, it's like a commodity. Whoever can afford it would end up sending their children to an
Would it
English
make sense, though, and we literally have 20 seconds left here, would it make sense to legislate the language of education for Pakistan?
I mean, it would be a great step towards achieving goals for education for all, particularly if that could be done.
But then you have all these other languages, so what do you do? Some kids don't, Urdu's not their mother tongue, it's either Punjabi or Sindhi or Balochi.
Yeah, certainly. But I think that would streamline the, the language of education at different tiers. At least they would bring, this would create more harmony, this would bring about the 4 provinces, 4 different language into one point of coordination, at least.
The whole point of at least having a national identity. Now, this is a very interesting topic. Hopefully, we'll revisit it again and have both of you wonderful ladies back on our show. Female power here on Malala Day. But for today, the time of our program is up. So I definitely want to thank our guests, Alice Albright of Global Partnerships and Sadaf Zulfikar of UNICEF, who joined us today on Malala Day. From our New York studios, I'm Aisha Tanzim. I want to thank you. But before I leave, don't forget to check out our website, urduvoa.com, our Facebook pages, follow us on Twitter. We'll give you all the live updates. Thank you very much and goodbye.